The red dress lay shredded in the dust, torn into jagged strips as if it had been clawed by thorns. Sarah knelt on one knee, clutching a rough, gray blanket tightly around her body. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven, but her eyes burned with a fire deeper than fear, a look that said the world had just stolen something it had no claim to. Moments earlier, the summer sun over Sage Hollow had scorched so fiercely you could have cooked eggs on a rock. The air shimmered, thick with the scent of horse sweat and dust. The marketplace buzzed, boots scuffing wooden porches, deals struck over barrels of oats, the steady hum of small-town life until 3 riders rode in. Their spurs jingled with each step, hats tilted low, dust clinging to their coats. No introductions were needed. The street fell silent, as if the air itself had been drained. Sarah had pleaded for a few more days to pay the protection money. Her small bakery was struggling, too many debts, too few customers. She stood tall, voice steady, hoping reason could outmatch cruelty. The lead rider didn't argue. He just smirked, dismounted, and grabbed her arm so hard she flinched. Then, in the middle of the street, in front of God and everyone, they tore her dress apart. The sound of ripping fabric cracked through the heat like a gunshot. The sheriff, an old man, stood by, his hand on his revolver, trembling but never drawing. Around him, Sage Hollow's men stood frozen, fists clenched, eyes dead. They all knew the cost of defiance. Barns burned in the night, cattle gunned down, brothers and sons buried in pine boxes. The riders laughed as they mounted up, tossing the torn fabric to the ground like trash. Their hoofbeats echoed down the dusty street, leaving only the creak of a swinging saloon door. Sarah stood alone in the blazing sun, gathering the scraps of her dignity along with her ruined dress. Somewhere in that silent crowd, a man decided this would be the last time Sage Hollow turned away. Jacob was there that day, though not in the street when it happened. He'd been hauling grain from his ranch on the town's edge, the kind of sweaty, dusty work that leaves a man's shirt glued to his skin. By the time he caught the murmurs and saw the crowd dispersing, Sarah had already left. He asked the stable hand what happened. The boy wouldn't meet his eyes, just mumbled about the riders and turned away. Jacob felt it thin, a slow, heavy burn in his chest. He'd seen hard times before. Lost his wife to fever 5 years back, buried her under the lone oak on his land. Since then, he'd kept to himself, tending cattle, mending fences, steering clear of other people's troubles. But Sarah wasn't just anyone. He'd been stopping by her bakery for months, claiming it was for the fresh rolls. Truth was, her quiet resilience drew him in the way she smiled, even on long, lean days. And now someone had tried to crush that spirit into the dirt. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, crickets chirping, staring at Sage Hollow's dark outline under the moonlight. In a town where law was just a word and fear wore the badge, good folks survived by keeping their heads down. But Jacob knew something else. Look away long enough, and there'd be nothing left worth seeing. By sunrise, he'd made his choice. This wasn't about heroics or revenge alone. It was about what Sage Hollow would be for the next generation, and about Sarah, about what a man risks when he's had enough. It happened a week later. The morning air carried that dry heat, promising a brutal afternoon. Folks were setting up market stalls, the clatter of crates and creak of wagon wheels filling the street. Then 2 riders came in, not the full gang, but their swagger said 2 was enough. They strutted like they owned Sage Hollow, collecting coins from merchants, sometimes more. When they reached a young woman selling eggs, one grabbed her chin, leaning in too close with a wolfish grin. That's when Jacob stepped out from an alley. He didn't shout or run, just walked steady, boots thumping in the dust. "Let her go," he said, voice low enough to halt the street. The rider laughed, but it died when Jacob's fist cracked his jaw, sending him sprawling. The second reached for his gun, but an older voice cut through. "Not today," said Sarah's father, Daniel, standing behind a barrel, rifle steady. That was enough for others to step forward, merchants, farmers, even the blacksmith with a hammer in hand. The riders saw the tide turn, realized they weren't paid to die in Sage Hollow, and rode out, leaving the street alive with a new energy. But if they thought that was the end, they were dead wrong. Jacob looked at the faces around him, people who'd been silent too long, now ready to plan. That afternoon, in the saloon's back room, they gathered to decide what came next. 3 days later, you could hear the gang before you saw them, hooves pounding, rifles rattling across saddles. Over 10 riders came down the main road like an invading army. But Sage Hollow wasn't the same town. Behind overturned wagons and crate stacks, townsfolk crouched in shadows. The blacksmith gripped his hammer, the storekeeper held a shotgun, and even old Mrs. Larson clutched a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. As the gang slowed in front of the saloon, a voice called from above. Flour bags burst from rooftops, blinding half the riders in a white cloud. The rest pushed forward but met barrels, sticks, and the crack of rifles. One bullet hit a rider's shoulder, sending him tumbling. The gang froze, realizing it wasn't just Jacob in their way, it was the whole damn town. From every doorway and alley, people closed in, eyes hard, hands steady. Jacob stepped forward, banged his hammer against the ground once, and said, "Come back here again, and there won't be a way out." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed spoke louder. The leader spat in the dust, eyed a town no longer afraid, and signaled retreat. They rode out slower than they came, not daring to look back. Word spread they'd moved on to bleed another town, one that hadn't found its spine. Sage Hollow was quiet again, not the fearful kind, but the kind that comes when folks know they've held their ground. The gang was gone, their hoofbeats fading. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people stepped out from behind barrels and doorways, brushing off dust, exchanging looks that said, "We did it." Sarah walked toward Jacob, her dress patched but her head high. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, eyes soft yet steady. He gave a small nod, the kind that says more than words. In the days that followed, Sage Hollow found a new rhythm. Merchants kept doors open without fear. Kids played in the streets. Jacob still worked his ranch, but every morning he stopped by Sarah's bakery, sometimes for rolls, sometimes for pie, always for her company. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something steadier, built from shared loss and the quiet comfort of not being alone. The town noticed and approved. In a place like Sage Hollow, you don't survive alone, you survive because someone's got your back. Maybe that's the real lesson. A town doesn't change because one man stands up. It changes when everyone decides they're done with fear. And sometimes, the strength to stand comes from the person you've cared about all along. So, if you were there that day, would you have stepped into the street or waited for someone else to go first?